In 2013, Alice Fredenham walked onto the Britain's Got Talent stage trembling with nerves, and moments later, Simon Cowell called her voice liquid gold. Millions believed they were watching the beginning of a huge singing career. But Alice never became the superstar many expected. After reaching the semifinals, she slowly disappeared from the spotlight. So what really happened after BGT, and what is Alice Fredenham doing now? Before Alice Fredenham became one of the most talked about singers on Britain's Got Talent, she was almost completely unknown to the British public. There was no huge record deal behind her, no long list of chart hits, and no army of fans waiting for her appearance. There was simply a quiet woman with a powerful voice, and a fear of performing in front of people. That fear would become one of the most important parts of Alice's story. Alice had spent years developing her voice and performing in smaller settings, but she was not the type of performer who seemed hungry for fame. In fact, when she eventually appeared on Britain's Got Talent in 2013, her nerves were obvious. She looked uncomfortable standing in front of the judges. Then she began to sing. Alice chose My Funny Valentine, a classic song that demanded control, emotion, and confidence. Instead of trying to overpower the room, she sang softly. Her voice was deep, warm, and almost haunting. The atmosphere changed immediately. The judges listened. The audience became silent. And then Simon Cowell gave her a description that would follow Alice for years. Liquid gold. For someone who had arrived looking terrified, the reaction was almost unbelievable. But there was something else happening beneath that audition. Alice was not simply discovering that she could sing. She was discovering what happened when millions of people suddenly started listening. Her audition quickly became a viral moment, eventually attracting tens of millions of views online. Cherry Red Records later described her original BGT appearance as having received more than 40 million YouTube views. Suddenly, the woman who had been nervous about standing on a television stage was being discussed as a potential star. And that created a huge question. Could Alice Fredenham actually handle the world that was opening in front of her? Because getting noticed is one thing. Building a career after everyone notices you is something completely different. Alice continued through the competition and reached the semifinals. But despite the enormous attention surrounding her audition, she did not become the winner of Britain's Got Talent. Her journey on the show ended before the final stage. For many contestants, that would have been the end of the dream. For Alice, however, it became something else. It became a doorway. And behind that doorway was an opportunity that would allow her to make music without depending entirely on a television competition. In 2015, Alice turned to her growing fanbase and launched a Kickstarter campaign to help fund an album. According to Cherry Red Records, the campaign raised significant funding, allowing her to record what became her debut album, Under the Covers. That detail matters, because Alice had not won the television show. She had not walked away with the biggest prize. Yet people were still willing to support her music. That meant the audience had not forgotten her. They wanted to hear more. And Alice was about to prove that her BGT audition was not just a 3-minute television moment. But before that happened, she had to face the first major turning point of her career, and it would reveal something surprising about what kind of artist she really wanted to become. Do you think a singer needs to win a talent show to build a successful career? Or can one unforgettable performance be enough to change everything? The answer in Alice's case would become much more complicated than anyone expected. But what happened after Alice Fredenham's unforgettable Britain's Got Talent audition was not the fairy tale ending many viewers expected. The audition had made her famous almost overnight. Millions had watched her sing. Simon Cowell had praised her extraordinary voice, and a large international fanbase began following her journey. Yet Alice still had to answer one difficult question. What could she do after BGT? The answer would take several years. After leaving the competition at the semifinal stage, Alice did not simply vanish. Instead, she began trying to turn her sudden television fame into a real music career. Her story was unusual because her biggest success had come from a single performance rather than years of commercial releases. And the pressure was now different. On television, Alice only needed to perform one song. In the music industry, she needed to build an entire identity. For a while, there were signs that the industry was interested. Music databases and biographies from the period reported that she had a short demo deal period with Sony before plans shifted toward making an album through fan support. Then came the decision that changed the direction of her career. Instead of waiting for a major label to completely control her future, Alice turned toward the people who had discovered her through BGT, her fans. In 2015, she launched a Kickstarter campaign to help finance an album. The response was strong enough to push the project forward, giving Alice the opportunity to record music on her own terms. And this was important, because Alice had lost the television competition. But she had not lost her audience. Her fans were still interested in that unusual voice they had heard years earlier. The album was recorded at real-world studios with professional musicians, and it became Under the Covers. It included songs such as My Funny Valentine, Wishing on a Star, Feel Like Making Love, and Sunshine of Your Love. Saxophonist and flautist Theo Travis also appeared on the project. For Alice, this was more than simply releasing an album. It was proof that the BGT moment could become something lasting. But there was a catch. The public had first fallen in love with Alice because of the atmosphere of her audition. She was nervous, vulnerable, almost frightened to be standing there. That vulnerability became part of her appeal. And once the television cameras disappeared, recreating that same magic became much harder. Still, the album eventually reached the UK Independent Album Breakers chart. According to the official charts database, Under the Covers peaked at number 19 and spent 1 week on the chart. It was not the massive mainstream breakthrough that some viewers may have imagined after her BGT audition. But it was something real. Alice had created a full album. She had turned a television audition into a professional recording project. And, perhaps most importantly, she had shown that she was not simply a contestant who had gone viral. She was an artist. Yet this is where Alice's story becomes especially interesting. Because after Under the Covers, the huge second chapter that fans were expecting never really arrived. There was no long run of major chart hits. No constant television appearances. No endless celebrity headlines. No transformation into the next massive British pop star. Instead, Alice became increasingly difficult to find in the mainstream spotlight. And that raised the question that would follow her for years. Why did someone with such a powerful voice become so quiet after receiving so much attention? Maybe Alice simply wanted a different kind of career. Maybe the music industry did not develop in the way people expected. Or maybe the person who seemed destined for fame never actually wanted fame to control her life. Whatever the answer, the next stage of Alice's story would take her far away from the image of the nervous BGT contestant standing beneath those bright studio lights. And while the world was waiting for another huge television moment, Alice was quietly building something else. For a moment, it looked as if Alice Fredenham had finally found the career everyone expected her to have. The shy singer who had once struggled to even stand confidently in front of the Britain's Got Talent judges had now released a professional album, and her voice was reaching listeners far beyond the original television audience. But the strange thing about Alice's rise was that it never followed the usual path. She did not become a pop superstar. She did not flood the charts with singles. Instead, she built a much quieter career around the quality of her voice. In February 2017, Alice released Under the Covers, a 10-track album featuring songs such as My Funny Valentine, Wishing on a Star, Feel Like Making Love, and Sunshine of Your Love. The album was released through Cherry Red Records and was recorded at Real World Studios. And there was something almost poetic about the album. Alice was returning to the song that had started everything. My Funny Valentine. It was the performance that had made Simon Cowell describe her voice as liquid gold. Now, years later, she was presenting her own recorded version as part of a complete professional album. The journey from frightened contestant to recording artist was complete. But commercially, the results were modest. Under the Covers reached number 19 on the UK Independent Album Breakers chart, spending 1 week on the chart. For some artists, that might have felt disappointing. For Alice, it was still a meaningful achievement. She had taken the attention from one television audition and turned it into an actual body of work. And perhaps more importantly, her music continued to find listeners long after Britain's Got Talent had moved on. Even today, streaming platforms show that her most famous performance has not been forgotten. Spotify currently lists Alice with thousands of monthly listeners, while My Funny Valentine remains her most streamed track on the platform. That is the part of Alice's story that is easy to miss. She may not have become a household name superstar, but she created something that survived the television moment. Her voice remained recognizable. Her original audition remained popular. And her album remained available to a new generation of listeners who could discover her without ever watching the original BGT broadcast. But then something unexpected happened. The bigger spotlight began to fade. Alice did not appear to chase celebrity in the way many reality show contestants do. There was no constant stream of interviews and television appearances keeping her name in the headlines. And slowly, the public began asking the question that had become almost impossible to avoid. Where did Alice Fredenham go? This is where her story becomes more complicated. Because disappearing from mainstream headlines does not necessarily mean disappearing from music. Sometimes an artist simply stops playing the fame game. And Alice's career appears to have followed a much quieter path than the one viewers imagined when she first walked onto that BGT stage. Her music remained available online, and her audience remained interested. But there was no second explosion comparable to her original audition. The woman who had once captured the attention of millions was becoming increasingly private. And for fans who remembered her trembling on that stage, that silence created an enormous mystery. Was Alice disappointed by the music industry? Did she decide that mainstream fame was not for her? Or had she simply found a different way to live after experiencing what sudden fame felt like? Those questions matter because Alice's story is not really about failing to become famous. It is about what happens after fame arrives unexpectedly. For a short time, the entire country was looking at her. Then the cameras moved on. But Alice was left with something much more valuable than a television audition. She had a voice, she had an album, and she had an audience that still remembered her. The real question was whether she wanted anything more. And as the years passed, the answer became harder to find. If you were Alice, would you keep chasing fame after one unforgettable moment? Or choose a quieter life where you could make music without the pressure? Because the next part of her story takes us into the biggest mystery surrounding her post-BGT life. Why someone with so much attention suddenly became so difficult to see. But the biggest mystery was not why Alice Fredenham failed to become a superstar. It was why, after creating so much excitement, she seemed to step away from the spotlight. The public had seen Alice as the nervous woman who suddenly became a sensation on Britain's Got Talent. Her audition had created enormous online attention, and later she turned that attention into a professional album. Yet, after Under the Covers, there was no obvious second wave of mainstream success. The official charts show that the album peaked at number 19 on the UK Independent Album Breakers chart and spent just 1 week there. And that is where expectations can become dangerous. When a contestant receives millions of views, people naturally expect the next step to be bigger. A hit single, a second album, television appearances, sold-out concerts, a major record deal. But real life rarely follows that perfect story. Alice had already experienced something many musicians spend their entire lives chasing: sudden public attention. The problem was that attention does not automatically become a lasting career. And Alice's personality made the situation even more unusual. She had never appeared to be the loud, attention-seeking type of performer. Her appeal came partly from the opposite quality. She seemed private, vulnerable, and deeply uncomfortable with the pressure surrounding a huge television audition. That created a strange contradiction. The very thing that made people love Alice was also the thing that made the world of celebrity seem unnatural for her. And once the cameras stopped following her, she became much harder to find. There is another important point here. There is no strong public evidence that Alice suffered some dramatic career-ending event after BGT. There is also no reliable evidence that she completely abandoned music because of some secret scandal. What we can verify is much simpler. Her documented discography remains centered on Under the Covers, released in 2017, with songs such as My Funny Valentine, Wishing on a Star, and Feel Like Makin' Love. Current music services still list that album and those recordings. So perhaps the word disappeared is misleading. Alice did not disappear from music. She disappeared from mainstream celebrity culture. And those are two very different things. Her songs remain available through major streaming services. My Funny Valentine continues to be one of her most prominent recordings, while other tracks from Under the Covers remain listed across music platforms. That means her legacy was never completely dependent on television. The BGT audience moved on, but the music stayed. And perhaps Alice understood something that many reality show contestants learn much later. Fame can be temporary, while the work you create can survive much longer. Still, for fans, the silence was difficult to understand. After all, Alice had once been presented as a potential star. Simon Cowell had praised her, millions had watched her, and a professional album had followed. So why wasn't there more? This is where we have to separate what is known from what is speculation. There is no verified public explanation that allows us to say Alice left the music industry because of one specific event. So it would be wrong to invent a dramatic reason. Instead, the public record points toward something quieter. A career that became selective. A performer who was no longer constantly visible. And an artist whose recorded work continued to exist even when the celebrity machine moved on. That may actually explain why Alice's story still interests people more than a simple success story would. Because her journey asks a question many people can understand. What happens when you get the opportunity you dreamed about, but discover that fame itself may not be what you wanted? Maybe success is not always about becoming bigger. Maybe sometimes it is about having the freedom to decide what happens next. And Alice's story becomes even more interesting when we look at where she stands today. Because in 2026, there is still evidence that people are searching for her music and listening to those recordings. But there is something noticeably missing. A huge public comeback, a major new album, or a constant stream of interviews explaining where she has been. That silence has left fans with one final question. What exactly is Alice Fredenham doing now? And the answer is not as dramatic as some internet stories might suggest, but it may be more revealing. Because the woman who once stood terrified in front of millions may have found a life where she no longer needs millions watching. And that may have been the most important decision of her entire journey. There was never a giant business empire behind Alice Fredenham. And that is important to understand. Unlike many reality TV stars who turn their television fame into fashion brands, beauty companies, books, or major commercial partnerships, Alice took a very different path. Her biggest investment was not a product. It was her music. After Britain's Got Talent, Alice used the attention from the show to build something she could actually control. Her Kickstarter campaign helped finance her debut album, Under the Covers, which was eventually released in 2017. The album was recorded at Real World Studios and featured 10 songs. That decision tells us something about Alice. She did not turn her BGT fame into a giant celebrity business. She turned it into a recording career. And in an industry where contestants can quickly become forgotten after their television appearance ends, that was a smart move. Her fans had already shown that they wanted more than one performance. They wanted an album. Alice gave them one. The project also had professional musicians behind it, including Theo Travis, whose work appears on the album. The songs were carefully selected to match Alice's distinctive style, rather than pushing her toward the kind of mainstream pop sound that dominates talent show competitions. That difference matters. Alice's greatest strength was never flashy choreography. It was atmosphere. Her voice was deep, soft, controlled, and emotional. So instead of trying to become another manufactured pop star, Under the Covers leaned into the kind of classic material that had already made her BGT audition so memorable. Songs like My Funny Valentine, Wishing on a Star, Feel Like Makin' Love, Hushabye Mountain, and Sunshine of Your Love gave her space to do what she did best, tell a story through her voice. And there is another fascinating part of this story. Alice's music has continued to exist even while her public profile became much quieter. Apple Music still lists Under the Covers and its songs, with My Funny Valentine among her most prominent tracks. So if you searched for Alice today, you might get the impression that she completely disappeared. But she didn't. Her work is still there. Her recordings are still available. People who discovered her on BGT can still listen to the voice that once shocked the judges. And new listeners can discover her without ever seeing the original audition. That may be Alice's most lasting achievement. Not millions of pounds. Not a huge fashion empire. Not endless celebrity headlines. But a collection of music that survived the television moment. And perhaps this is why her story feels different from the usual talent show success story. Most people remember the contestant. Very few remember what happens after the cameras turn away. Alice showed that there can be another kind of success, one that is smaller, quieter, and much less visible. But there is still one unanswered question. If Alice had such a powerful voice and such a huge audience, why didn't she release more music? That is where we have to be careful. There is no reliable public evidence showing that she built a major second business, launched a secret empire, or deliberately walked away because of one dramatic incident. The documented music record available today is still heavily centered on Under the Covers, her 2017 album. AllMusic, for example, lists that album as her recorded release. So rather than inventing a dramatic explanation, the honest answer is that Alice's public career simply became very quiet. And that silence may actually be the biggest clue. Because fame had given Alice attention. Music gave her something different. A way to be remembered without having to constantly be seen. Maybe that was enough. And while the entertainment industry continued searching for its next big star, Alice's voice remained frozen in those recordings, waiting for someone to press play. But what is she actually doing now in 2026? That is the question fans have been asking for years. And the answer reveals just how completely Alice changed her relationship with fame. So what is Alice Fredenham doing now? The honest answer is more mysterious than many fans might expect. As of 2026, there is very little reliable public information about Alice's current day-to-day life or career plans. There is no strong evidence of a major comeback, a new album, or a return to Britain's Got Talent. And that is important, because it means we should not turn the gaps in her public life into rumors. What we can say is that Alice's music is still available, and her Under the Covers album remains part of her recorded legacy. Her famous My Funny Valentine performance also continues to introduce new listeners to her voice. In other words, Alice may have stepped away from the spotlight, but her voice never really left. There is also a fascinating piece of public record evidence from her post-BGT years. A company called Alice Fredenham Ltd. was incorporated in 2015, but company's house records show that it was dissolved in August 2016. That does not prove anything dramatic about her career. It simply shows that one business chapter connected to her name eventually ended. And perhaps that fits the larger story. Alice's journey was never a straight line towards celebrity. It was a sudden explosion of attention, followed by a quieter attempt to build something meaningful from it. She went from being a nervous singer almost nobody knew to a contestant watched by millions. She received extraordinary praise. She reached the semifinals. She built enough support to finance an album through her fans. And she released music that still exists today. But she never became the superstar that television audiences imagined. And maybe that is not a failure. Maybe we have been measuring her success by the wrong standard. Because Alice did something that many people who chase fame never managed to do. She created music on her own terms, then stepped away from the constant pressure of being watched. Her story also reminds us how quickly television fame can disappear. One year, millions of people are talking about you. A few years later, they are asking where you went. But that does not erase what happened. When Alice stood on the Britain's Got Talent stage, she was terrified. Then she opened her mouth and changed the room. That moment cannot be taken away from her. Neither can the album she created afterward. And neither can the listeners who still press play today. Perhaps the biggest lesson from Alice Fredenham is not about becoming famous. It is about understanding that being seen by millions and living a meaningful life are not necessarily the same thing. Some performers spend decades trying to become impossible to ignore. Alice became impossible to forget, and then chose a much quieter path. If you were watching her BGT audition back in 2013, did you believe Alice Fredenham would become a huge international star? Or did you think her quiet, emotional style was always better suited to a smaller audience? Let us know what you remember about Alice in the comments. And if you enjoy discovering what really happened to the people who once captured the world's attention, subscribe, because some of the most surprising stories begin after the cameras stop rolling. Alice Fredenham may not have become the superstar many predicted, but she left behind something far more personal than a television moment. A voice, a story, and a performance people still remember more than a decade later. And perhaps that is where her story should end. Not with the question of why she disappeared, but with a different question. What if Alice never really disappeared at all? Maybe she simply stopped trying to be famous. And sometimes, walking away from the spotlight is not the end of a story. It is the moment someone finally gets to live it.